Ethan Sinclair stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the twinkling lights of New York City stretching endlessly before him. The skyline was breathtaking, a testament to ambition and power. His ambition, his power. He should have felt accomplished, even invincible. Instead, he felt nothing. The penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the central heating system. Beyond the glass, the world pulsed with life. Laughter from rooftop bars, the honk of impatient taxis, the steady rhythm of a city that never slept. But here, in his $20 million fortress overlooking Central Park, the quiet was deafening. His gaze dropped to the glass of bourbon in his hand. Half empty. Or was it half full? He smirked humorlessly. The world saw Ethan Sinclair as a visionary, a billionaire tech mogul who had transformed Sinclair Innovations from a mid-level software firm into an industry titan. But tonight, like many nights, he was just a man drinking alone, haunted by the one thing money couldn't buy back. Nora. His wife had been gone for nearly 3 years, but the grief still clung to him like a second skin. The accident had taken her in an instant, leaving behind a hollow space that no amount of wealth or success could fill. Then there was Logan, his 6-year-old son, his reason for staying afloat, yet also the source of his deepest fear. Logan had been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at birth. From that moment on, Ethan had dedicated his life to controlling the uncontrollable. His son's world was built on routine, sterility, and precautions. Nannies, doctors, air purifiers, daily breathing treatments. He had spared no expense in ensuring Logan's safety, and yet, no matter how much he tried to shield his son from harm, the fear of losing him gnawed at his every waking thought. Ethan tossed back the rest of his bourbon and turned from the window. The penthouse, sleek and modern with its marble floors and leather furniture, felt colder than usual tonight. His assistant, Margaret, had left hours ago after yet another tense discussion about Logan's care. "Logan needs stability, Ethan," she had said, her voice laced with exasperation. "You've gone through 6 nannies in the past year. At this rate, you'll run out of qualified candidates." "I'll hire another," Ethan had responded dismissively. Margaret had exhaled sharply. "That's the problem. You don't keep them. You don't trust them, and Logan is the one paying the price." Trust. A word easier said than lived. He ran a hand through his hair, walking toward the security panel embedded in the wall. A single touch activated the multiple surveillance feeds streaming from his Hamptons estate, where Logan was currently asleep under the watchful eye of the night nurse. The cameras were necessary. They ensured safety. They ensured control. At least, that's what he told himself. As the monitors flickered to life, Ethan's jaw tightened. He watched Logan's small frame curled beneath his blankets, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The boy looked so much like Nora it hurt. Dark curls, delicate features, the same quiet determination in his eyes. A part of Ethan knew Margaret was right. Logan needed more than state-of-the-art medical equipment and a revolving door of caregivers. He needed stability, connection, someone he could trust. But how was Ethan supposed to entrust his son's well-being to someone else when he had already lost the person he trusted most? The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sinclair, you have a call from Margaret," his evening housekeeper announced. Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Put her through." Margaret's voice came through the speaker, sharp as ever. "I've found a nanny." He exhaled. "We both know it won't work out." "You haven't even heard her name yet." Ethan leaned against the bar counter. "Fine. Let's hear it." "Sophie Ramirez." Something in her tone caught his attention. Margaret wasn't one for unnecessary dramatics. "And?" "She's different, Ethan. Former pediatric nurse. Left the hospital after losing a patient she was particularly close to. Excellent references. But it's more than that. She doesn't just care for children. She connects with them. Ethan stared at the security feeds, watching the silent flickers of his son's isolated world. He had hired the best, highly trained professionals, top-tier caregivers. None had lasted. None had been enough. Yet, something about this name, Sophie Ramirez, held weight. He couldn't explain why, but for the first time in a long time, he hesitated before dismissing Margaret's suggestion outright. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "Already did," Margaret replied. "She'll be at the Hamptons estate tomorrow morning." Ethan smirked. "You always assume I'll say yes." "I assume you'll do what's best for your son. Eventually." The line clicked dead. Ethan exhaled, setting the empty bourbon glass down with a soft clink. Sophie Ramirez. Another name, another attempt at stability, another test of trust. He turned back to the security monitors, watching Logan's peaceful sleeping form. Tomorrow he would meet this woman. And tomorrow he would determine if she was yet another mistake, or the person who might change everything. Ethan Sinclair never liked first impressions. They were deceptive, shaped by calculated smiles and polished resumes. He had learned long ago that people were rarely who they pretended to be, especially those who sought to enter his world. And yet, as he stepped into the sunlit foyer of his Hamptons estate, he found himself strangely curious about the woman waiting for him in the living room. Margaret had already arrived, standing near the fireplace with an unreadable expression. Across from her, Sophie Ramirez sat with an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't dressed in the stiff, professional attire of the previous nannies. Instead, she wore a simple navy blouse and beige slacks, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. There was something effortlessly warm about her, something unguarded. Ethan didn't trust it. He walked in, every movement precise, controlled. "Ms. Ramirez," he greeted, his voice devoid of warmth. She rose to her feet, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Mr. Sinclair, it's a pleasure to meet you." Her voice was steady, without the nervous energy most interviewees carried. "Interesting." Margaret cleared her throat. "Sophie has an impressive background in pediatric care. She's worked extensively with children who have chronic illnesses." Ethan crossed his arms. "And why did you leave the hospital?" A flicker of something passed through Sophie's eyes, something she quickly masked. "I lost a patient," she said simply, "and I realized I wanted to be somewhere I could make a difference beyond the walls of a hospital." Ethan studied her. There was no embellishment, no attempt to impress, just honesty. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to make of someone, and that made Sophie Ramirez dangerous. Sophie followed Margaret down the long, sunlit hallway of the Hamptons estate, her steps light but steady. This wasn't the first time she had entered a home filled with wealth, but there was something about this house, about the silence in it, that unsettled her. It was too pristine, too orderly, too lonely. Margaret stopped in front of a large oak door and knocked gently. "Logan, sweetheart, you have a visitor." There was no response. Margaret sighed and pushed the door open, revealing a spacious room decorated in muted blues and grays. It was spotless, almost museum-like. On the far side of the room, near a wide window seat, a small boy sat hunched over a book. Dark curls framed his face, and he looked up at them with sharp, cautious eyes that were far too observant for a child his age. Sophie's heart squeezed. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a child who had learned to expect goodbyes. "Logan," Margaret said gently, "this is Sophie Ramirez. She's going to be spending some time with you." Logan said nothing, his fingers tightening around the edges of his book. Sophie took a slow step forward, careful not to invade his space. "Hi, Logan," she said softly. I hear you love dinosaurs. His little brows furrowed. He darted a glance at Margaret, then back at Sophie. Who told you that? Sophie smiled. A little bird, or maybe it was Margaret. His lips twitched, but he quickly masked it. What kind of dinosaurs do you know about? He challenged. Sophie crossed her arms, pretending to think. Let's see. I know about the T-Rex, of course. But did you know that the velociraptor was actually much smaller than they showed in the movies? Logan blinked. Everyone knows that. But do you know which dinosaur had the longest claws? He tilted his head. The Rhizinosaurus? Sophie grinned. That's right. 3 feet long. Pretty impressive. A flicker of interest shone in his blue eyes, but he quickly looked away, as if remembering that he wasn't supposed to get attached. Margaret gave Sophie a small nod before stepping back toward the door. I'll let you two get acquainted. Sophie turned to Logan. I know meeting new people isn't always fun, but I'm here to make things a little easier for you. Logan didn't answer. Instead, he slowly set his book down and looked toward the corner of the room, where a plastic nebulizer mask sat on a sterile white table. Are you here to make me do my treatments? Sophie's heart clenched. She could see it now. The cycle of caregivers, the medical routines, the structure that had become his entire life. No, she said. I'm here to make them less awful. Logan's gaze lifted to hers, skeptical but curious. How? She crouched down to his level. Have you ever tried using a nebulizer while pretending you're an astronaut breathing in space air? A pause. Then a tiny, reluctant shake of his head. Well, Sophie said conspiratorially, I happen to be an expert in astronaut training. If you let me, I can show you a few tricks. Logan studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. Ethan watched the interaction unfold from the surveillance feed in his study, his jaw tight. Logan rarely warmed up to anyone. The boy had been through too many caregivers, too much upheaval, and yet here he was, engaged, curious. That was new. He took a sip of coffee, eyes narrowing as Sophie knelt beside Logan, explaining how to pretend his nebulizer treatment was a space mission. It was a simple trick, but an effective one. Logan was smiling. A real smile. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that. Still, it didn't mean she'd last. Downstairs, Sophie continued weaving her story, her tone light and full of excitement. So, Captain Logan, your mission is to inhale enough space air to complete your oxygen levels before re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Logan hesitated, eyeing her warily. And if I don't? She gasped dramatically. Then you'll run out of oxygen and have to stay in space forever. Logan thought about that for a moment, then gave her a small nod. Okay, but I get to be in charge. Sophie saluted. Of course, you're the captain. He reached for the nebulizer mask, slipping it over his nose and mouth, and Sophie turned on the machine. The rhythmic hum filled the quiet room, but instead of the usual tense silence, Logan's eyes remained bright, his fingers curled, as if piloting a spacecraft. Sophie sat beside him, watching as he took slow, measured breaths. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. She was good, too good, and that made him uneasy. Margaret knocked lightly on the open door. You're going to have to talk to her eventually. Ethan exhaled. I don't trust her. Margaret raised a brow. And why is that? She's trying too hard. Margaret gave him a knowing look. Or maybe she just cares. Ethan scoffed. They all care in the beginning. Margaret sighed, stepping closer. Look, I know trust doesn't come easily to you, but Logan needs this. He needs her. Ethan stared at the screen, watching as Sophie gently tapped Logan's knee, signaling the end of the mission. The boy pulled off the mask, beaming. Damn it. Margaret might be right. Later that evening, Sophie found Ethan waiting for her in the study, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what your angle is," he said coolly, "but let's get something straight. You work for me. You follow my rules." Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here for Logan, not you." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't used to people standing their ground with him. "And Logan doesn't need a nanny," she continued. "He needs someone who sees him, not his illness." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "I see him." Sophie tilted her head, studying him. "Do you?" A charged silence stretched between them before Ethan turned away. "Don't overstep, Ms. Ramirez." Sophie exhaled, standing her ground. "Then don't stand in the way of what's best for your son." Ethan didn't respond. But as she left the study, he knew one thing for certain. Sophie Ramirez was going to be a problem. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. The following morning, Sophie arrived in the dining room to find Logan already at the table, swinging his feet beneath his chair as he played with a set of plastic dinosaur figurines. Across from him, Ethan sat with his laptop open, barely glancing up as he typed. The scene looked normal enough, except for the tension that seemed to linger in the air between them. "Good morning, Captain Logan," Sophie greeted, offering a smile as she set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. "Did you dream of any space missions last night?" Logan grinned. "Yeah, I made it to Mars." Sophie gasped. "Mars? That's impressive. Did you find any aliens?" "Only fossilized ones," Logan said with an air of importance, making his toy raptor stomp across the table. Ethan finally looked up, his gaze landing on Sophie. "You don't have to make breakfast," he said coolly. "There are chefs for that." Sophie shrugged, unbothered by his dismissive tone. "I like cooking, and Logan actually eats when I make it." Logan nodded in agreement, taking a big bite of his toast. "It's better than the fancy food." Ethan sighed, but before he could reply, a voice interrupted them. "Ethan, darling, I thought I'd find you here." Sophie turned to see a tall, elegant woman saunter into the room. She was dressed in a sleek designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and she carried the unmistakable air of someone who had never been told no. Sophie instantly recognized her from magazine covers, Vanessa Harrington, the high society socialite with a keen interest in wealthy men. Vanessa barely spared Sophie a glance before setting her sights on Ethan. "I stopped by to remind you about the gala tonight. The board is expecting you." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple. "Vanessa, I told you. I'll see if I can make it." She pouted slightly, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. "You work too much, Ethan. You need to enjoy yourself." Sophie, sensing the shift in atmosphere, turned her attention back to Logan, who was suddenly very focused on his food. She could feel Vanessa's gaze flicker toward her, assessing, judging. "And who is this?" Vanessa finally asked, her tone clipped. Sophie wiped her hands on a napkin before extending one. "Sophie Ramirez, Logan's nanny." Vanessa arched a perfectly sculpted brow, but didn't take the offered handshake. Instead, she smiled in that practiced way that didn't reach her eyes. "How charming." Sophie didn't miss the implication behind the word. "Ethan, darling, are you really hiring help from the outside now?" Vanessa continued, clearly amused. "You know, I could have found someone with a bit more—" Her eyes flicked over Sophie. "Polish." Sophie stiffened, but before she could respond, Ethan set his coffee cup down with an audible clink. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "Sophie is more than qualified." Vanessa's smile faltered for the briefest second before she recovered. "Of course. I just want what's best for you." For a moment, Sophie wondered if Vanessa was speaking about Ethan or herself. Logan, clearly unimpressed with Vanessa, turned to Sophie and tugged on her sleeve. "Can we go play outside after breakfast?" Sophie ruffled his curls. "Of course, Captain." As she stood to clear the table, she felt Ethan's gaze lingering on her longer than before. Vanessa noticed too, and for the first time, Sophie wondered if she had just unknowingly stepped into something far more complicated than a simple nannying job. Later that evening, as she helped Logan prepare for bed, Sophie found herself still thinking about Ethan's reaction at breakfast. The way he had defended her, the way Vanessa had seemed irritated by it. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It didn't matter. She wasn't here for Ethan Sinclair's approval or attention. She was here for Logan. But as she turned off the lights and Logan whispered, "You're staying, right?" she knew that this job, this family, was becoming something far more personal than she had anticipated. Sophie had begun to settle into the routine of caring for Logan, finding joy in the small victories, his laughter, the way he reached for her hand when he was tired, the trust that was slowly building between them. But trust, as she knew too well, was fragile. It shattered the day Logan discovered the cameras. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, when she had taken him outside to the sprawling backyard for some fresh air. He had been eager to show her his favorite hiding spot near the rose bushes. But as he crouched near a tree, his fingers brushed against something metallic. A small, nearly invisible security camera. Logan pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. His small face twisted in confusion before anger took over. "What is this?" he demanded, looking up at Sophie. Sophie frowned, kneeling beside him. "It looks like a security camera." Logan's fists clenched. "Dad is spying on us." Her stomach dropped. "Logan, I'm sure it's just for safety." But Logan wasn't listening. He was already running toward the house, his little feet pounding against the patio floor. Sophie followed, her heart hammering in her chest. By the time she reached the study, Logan had already thrown the door open. Ethan looked up from his desk, clearly surprised by the intrusion. "Logan, you put cameras everywhere?" Logan's voice trembled with betrayal. "Even outside?" Ethan's expression hardened. "They're for your protection." "I don't need protecting, I need you to trust me." Logan's voice cracked, his chest rising and falling quickly. "You don't trust anyone, not me, not Sophie." Sophie stood frozen in the doorway, torn between stepping in and giving them space. But Ethan's silence was worse than anything he could have said. Logan turned on his heel, storming past her. "I hate you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion before disappearing down the hall. Ethan's shoulders stiffened at the words, but his face remained unreadable. Sophie exhaled, finally stepping forward. "He's right, you know." Ethan's gaze snapped to hers, dark and unyielding. "This isn't your concern." Sophie crossed her arms. "Logan is my concern, and you're hurting him more than you realize." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Sophie let out a breath, shaking her head. "Trust can't be built through surveillance, Ethan. It's built by showing up, by listening, by proving you care. You're going to lose him if you don't start trusting him." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what would you have me do?" Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "Take the cameras down." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Ethan looked away. And for the first time, Sophie wondered if he was truly capable of change. Sophie woke the next morning with an uneasy feeling. Logan had barely spoken to her after the confrontation with Ethan the day before. He had gone to bed quietly, retreating into himself in a way that broke her heart. She knew trust could be shattered in an instant, and she was afraid that Logan once again was pulling away. As she made her way downstairs, she found the house quieter than usual. Margaret greeted her with a nod, a knowing look in her eyes. He hasn't come down for breakfast, she said softly. Sophie sighed. I'll check on him. She made her way to Logan's room, knocking lightly before stepping inside. He was sitting on the floor, his back against his bed, staring at a book, but not really reading it. Hey, Captain, she said gently. Want some breakfast? Logan shook his head without looking up. Sophie sat down beside him. I know you're mad at your dad. And I get it. What he did hurt. Logan's fingers tightened around the pages of his book. He doesn't trust me. He never has. Sophie hesitated before responding. Sometimes grown-ups get scared too. And sometimes they try to control things because they don't know how else to keep the people they love safe. Logan finally looked up at her. That doesn't make it right. She nodded. No, it doesn't. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Logan's lip trembled. Then why doesn't he act like it? Sophie had no answer for that, but she knew who did. Ethan sat in his office, staring blankly at his laptop screen. The words on the screen blurred together, and for once he couldn't focus. Logan's words, his son's raw, unfiltered pain, echoed in his head. I hate you. He ran a hand down his face. He wasn't an emotional man. He had built an empire on logic, on precision, on control. But none of that mattered when it came to his son. And yet, he had failed him. Again. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He expected Margaret, but it was Sophie. She walked in without waiting for an invitation, her arms crossed. We need to talk. Ethan sighed. If this is about yesterday, it is. Sophie's voice was firm. Logan's hurt, and not just about the cameras. He thinks you don't trust him. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. He's a child. He doesn't understand. He understands more than you give him credit for, she interrupted. He understands that his father watches him like he's a problem to be managed, not a son to be loved. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? Sophie leaned against the desk, her dark eyes locked onto his. You keep people at a distance, Ethan. You think control is the same as love, but it's not. Love is messy, it's uncertain, and it's built on trust. Ethan pushed his chair back, standing. And what would you have me do, Sophie? Remove every measure of security and hope for the best? I would have you show him that he matters more than your fears. Sophie's voice softened. Logan is waiting for you to prove to him that he can trust you. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Ethan looked at her, not just as an employee, but as someone who genuinely saw him. And that scared him. Take the cameras down, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Or one day, Logan won't just be running to his room, he'll be running away from you. Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't like ultimatums, but this one was different. This one was necessary. Sophie turned to leave, but before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. I'll think about it. She turned back, meeting his gaze. Don't think too long. Then she was gone, leaving Ethan standing in the silence of his own making, feeling the first crack in the armor he had spent years constructing. Ethan stood in front of Logan's door later that night, his hand hovering over the handle. He had hesitated before, but never like this. Never with the weight of his own failure pressing against his chest. Finally, exhaling slowly, he knocked twice before stepping inside. Logan was curled up in bed, facing the window. He didn't turn as Ethan entered, but Ethan could see from the way his little shoulders were tense that he wasn't asleep. I know you're awake, Ethan said softly, stepping further into the room. He sat down in the chair beside Logan's bed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. I messed up, buddy. Logan didn't move. Ethan sighed, running a hand down his face. I thought I was protecting you, but I wasn't. I was just making you feel like a prisoner in your own home." A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, Logan said, "I don't like the cameras." Ethan nodded, even though Logan couldn't see him. "I know, and I'll take them down." Logan finally turned, blinking up at his father in surprise. "Really?" Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Yeah, really." For the first time in a long time, Ethan saw something soften in Logan's eyes. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was something close to hope. After a few moments of silence, Logan's voice broke the stillness. "Mom wouldn't have put up cameras." Ethan's breath hitched. The mention of Nora sent a sharp pain through his chest. "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "She wouldn't have." Logan hesitated before reaching out, his small fingers curling around Ethan's hand. "I miss her." Ethan squeezed his son's hand gently. "Me too." Sophie stood outside the room, unseen, listening to the exchange. A small, hopeful smile touched her lips. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan Sinclair wasn't as unreachable as he seemed. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to care more than she should. The next morning, Sophie awoke to an unfamiliar silence in the estate. The house, which usually carried the distant sounds of Logan playing or the low murmur of Ethan on a business call, felt eerily still. Something was off. She made her way downstairs, only to find Margaret waiting at the bottom of the staircase, her arms crossed, concern written all over her face. "He's in his study," Margaret said without Sophie even having to ask, "and he's not in a good mood." Sophie exhaled, bracing herself. She had seen Ethan angry before, but something about Margaret's tone made her uneasy. Steeling herself, she walked to the study and knocked before pushing open the door. Ethan stood near his desk, gripping a file so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Papers were scattered across the desk. Police reports, articles, and documents that Sophie couldn't quite make out. Ethan barely glanced up. "You shouldn't be here." Sophie frowned, stepping inside. "Something's wrong." "What is it?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, tossing one of the reports onto the desk. "You want to know what's wrong? I've spent years blaming myself for Nora's accident, wondering if I could have done something differently, if my negligence had cost her life. But now," he gestured to the file, "now I find out it wasn't an accident at all." Sophie's breath caught. "What are you saying?" He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes burning with something raw and dangerous. "I'm saying my wife was murdered." The words hung in the air, suffocating in their weight. Sophie stepped closer cautiously. "Ethan, I had my suspicions," he continued, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "The brakes on her car failed, but now I have proof. Someone tampered with them." Sophie felt the room tilt slightly. "Who?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. "A name came up in the investigation. Maxwell Bennett." Sophie frowned. "Your former head of security?" Ethan gave a sharp nod. "I trusted him. He was supposed to protect my family. Instead, he was bribed by a rival company looking to weaken me. And my wife—" His voice broke for a fraction of a second before he steadied himself. "She paid the price." Sophie's heart ached for him. For all his cold control, his ruthless efficiency, he was still a man who had lost his wife in the most unimaginable way. And now, to learn that it wasn't fate or bad luck, but murder? No wonder he looked like he was about to combust. She reached out tentatively. "Ethan, you don't have to go through this alone." He took a step back, shaking his head. "You don't understand, Sophie. This isn't just about me grieving anymore. I have to do something. I have to make sure Logan is safe. Ethan, listen to me." Sophie's voice softened. "I know you're angry. I know you want justice. But don't let this consume you. Logan needs you now more than ever." His eyes darkened. And what if I fail him too? What if, just like Nora, I can't protect him? Sophie stepped closer, undeterred. Then you let people help you. You let Logan love you. You let yourself trust. For a long moment, Ethan just stared at her. Then suddenly, as if realizing how close they were, he looked away, shaking his head. I don't need help. Sophie exhaled sharply. Ethan, don't shut me out. Don't shut Logan out. But his walls were back up. The brief vulnerability she had seen in him the night before was gone, replaced by the cold, calculated man she had first met. I appreciate what you've done for Logan, he said stiffly, but this isn't your problem. Something in Sophie cracked at his words. She had spent so much time trying to reach him, to help him see what was right in front of him. And yet, here he was, pushing her away again. Her next words came before she could stop them. Then maybe I shouldn't be here. Ethan's gaze snapped back to her, something flickering in his eyes. What? If you won't let me help, if you won't trust me, then maybe I don't belong here. Sophie's voice was steady, but her heart ached. A muscle ticked in Ethan's jaw. You're serious. Sophie swallowed past the lump in her throat. I love Logan, but I can't stay here if I'm just another person you're going to shut out. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. Then go. Sophie felt the finality of those words like a slap. She nodded once, blinking back the sting of tears, and turned toward the door. Before she left, she paused. Logan deserves better than this, Ethan. And so do you. Then she walked out, leaving Ethan alone in his study, drowning in a storm of his own making. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to fix it. The moment Sophie closed the door behind her, she felt an unbearable weight pressing on her chest. She had left, just as Ethan had told her to, but every step away from the Sinclair estate felt wrong. Still, she couldn't stay in a place where she was unwanted, not when the man who needed her help refused to take it. She had barely reached her room to pack her things, when a soft voice made her freeze in place. Sophie! She turned to see Logan standing in the hallway, his small frame barely illuminated by the light spilling in from the windows. His eyes, so much like Ethan's, were wide and uncertain. Where are you going? He asked, his voice fragile, as if he already knew the answer but was desperate to be wrong. Sophie's throat tightened. She knelt to his level, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Logan, sweetheart, You're leaving, he whispered, his lower lip trembling. Just like the others. Sophie's heart shattered. No, honey, it's not like that. Yes, it is, Logan suddenly yelled, surprising her. Tears welled up in his blue eyes. They all leave. Mom left. Every nanny leaves. And now you're leaving too. Sophie reached for him, but he flinched back, shaking his head. You said you weren't like them. You said you'd stay. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. I wanted to stay, Logan. I really did. Then why won't you? His voice cracked, and the sight of his pain broke her in ways she hadn't expected. Sophie hesitated, torn between the truth and what was easier to say. Because your dad doesn't want me here. Logan's expression twisted in frustration. Dad doesn't know anything, he shouted. He doesn't know how to be happy. He doesn't know how to... He choked on his own words, scrubbing at his wet cheeks with his sleeve. He doesn't know how to love anymore. Sophie inhaled sharply, her own tears threatening to spill over. She cupped Logan's face gently. That's not true. He loves you more than anything in this world. Logan sniffled. Then why does he keep hurting people? She had no answer, because she knew Logan was right. Ethan Sinclair didn't know how to let people in, and if he didn't learn soon, he would lose more than just Sophie. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by Logan's quiet sniffles. Sophie hugged him tightly, whispering, "I love you, Logan, and no matter where I am, I'll always care about you." His small arms clung to her, his face buried in her shoulder. "I don't want you to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut. "I know, baby, I know." But in the end, she still stood up and walked away. Margaret found Ethan hours later, still in his study, staring blankly at the wall. The tension in the room was suffocating, his shoulders rigid, his expression unreadable. She placed a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. "She's gone." Ethan didn't move, but something in his jaw tightened. Margaret didn't expect him to respond. Instead, she leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "You know, for a genius, you're a real idiot sometimes." Ethan exhaled slowly, finally dragging his gaze to meet hers. "Margaret—" "No," she cut him off. "You listen to me for once." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, but he didn't stop her. Margaret took that as permission to continue. "That woman, Sophie, has been the best thing to happen to Logan since Nora died," she said, her voice firm. "And not just to Logan. To you, too." Ethan's expression hardened. "She overstepped." "She cared," Margaret corrected, "and you punished her for it." Ethan clenched his jaw, but Margaret wasn't done. "Logan is upstairs crying his heart out. He thinks everyone leaves him. And today you just proved him right." A flicker of something passed through Ethan's face. Guilt, maybe, but it was gone just as fast. "I had no choice." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's the biggest lie you've ever told yourself." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she shook her head. "You're going to lose them both, Ethan. And when you realize that, I just hope it's not too late." She turned and walked out, leaving Ethan alone in his study, drowning in a storm of his own making. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to fix it. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind replayed Margaret's words over and over, each one hitting him harder than the last. He had pushed Sophie away. Worse, he had broken Logan's heart. And now he sat in the suffocating silence of his home, feeling the emptiness of it like never before. But regret wasn't something Ethan had the luxury of wallowing in, because in the early hours of the morning, a scream shattered the quiet. "Dad!" Logan's terrified voice echoed through the house. Ethan was on his feet before he could think. He sprinted down the hallway, his pulse a frantic drum against his ribs. He burst into Logan's room to find his son gasping for air, his small body curled in on itself as he clutched his chest. Panic seized Ethan's throat. He had seen Logan struggle before, but not like this. His breaths were short, erratic, too shallow. His lips were turning pale. Logan, breathe," Ethan said, kneeling beside him, his hands hovering uselessly. "Where's your nebulizer?" Logan shook his head, unable to speak. His little fingers clutched at Ethan's sleeve in pure desperation. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face lined with fear. "I'll call the doctor." "No time," Ethan snapped, scooping Logan into his arms. "We need Sophie." Margaret didn't argue. She grabbed the car keys and followed as Ethan raced down the stairs, Logan trembling against his chest. Sophie had barely unpacked her bags when the urgent knocking at her apartment door startled her. It was still early, the city outside barely waking up. But the pounding was relentless. Heart hammering, she swung open the door and froze. Ethan Sinclair stood there disheveled, his eyes wild with desperation. And in his arms, Logan. The boy's face was pale, his breaths coming too fast. Sophie's training kicked in before her emotions could. "Bring him inside," she ordered, ushering them into her apartment. Ethan laid Logan on her couch as Sophie rushed to grab her emergency medical kit. "What happened?" "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice rough with helplessness. "He was fine, and then Then he couldn't breathe. Sophie forced herself to stay calm as she checked Logan's vitals. His breathing was dangerously shallow. She reached for the nebulizer she kept in her bag, grateful for her instincts to always be prepared. "Logan, sweetheart, listen to me," she said softly, fitting the mask over his face. "You need to breathe slow, okay? In and out, like we practiced." Logan's frightened eyes met hers, and she gave him a reassuring nod. He clung to her hand, his tiny fingers curling around hers as he fought to follow her instructions. Ethan hovered beside them, his expression a war of emotions: fear, guilt, desperation. "Is he going to be okay?" Sophie didn't look at him. She focused on Logan, rubbing his back gently. "He needs to calm down. Panic is making it worse." Minutes stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity, until finally Logan's breathing began to steady. The tightness in his chest eased, his small body relaxing against the couch. Sophie let out a shaky breath, brushing the hair from his damp forehead. "There we go. That's my brave astronaut." Logan blinked up at her, exhaustion settling in. "You came back." Her heart clenched. "Of course I did." A choked sound came from behind her. She turned to find Ethan standing there, his hands in his hair, his entire body coiled with tension. But his eyes, they weren't cold or guarded. They were full of something raw and real. I didn't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help him." Sophie exhaled. "You did the right thing bringing him to me." Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, something unspoken passing between them. A plea, a realization. "I need you, Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse. "Logan needs you." Sophie swallowed hard. "I won't stay unless things change, Ethan." A beat of silence. Then Ethan nodded, his expression filled with something close to surrender. "They will." Ethan kept his promise. By the time Sophie arrived back at the Sinclair estate later that afternoon, the security team had already begun dismantling the cameras. The house, once filled with the quiet hum of constant surveillance, felt lighter, freer. It was the first tangible proof that Ethan was trying. Logan, still weak but recovering, was resting in his bed when Sophie checked in on him. His small smile upon seeing her nearly undid her. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. She brushed a gentle hand over his curls. "I told you I would." His fingers curled around hers, holding on tight. "Dad took the cameras down." "I know," she whispered. "That's a big step for him." Logan nodded sleepily, his grip loosening as he drifted off. Sophie sat beside him for a few more moments, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Then she stood, heading downstairs, where she knew another difficult conversation awaited. Ethan was in his study, exactly where Sophie had expected to find him. But instead of being buried in work, he was staring at a stack of papers spread out before him. His expression was unreadable, his hands steepled beneath his chin. "You actually did it," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I wasn't sure you would." Ethan looked up, his blue eyes darker than usual. "I told you things would change." She studied him, searching for signs of hesitation, of deflection. But there was none. "Logan is happier already," she admitted. "That means something." Ethan exhaled and gestured to the papers in front of him. "I've been looking into Maxwell Bennett." Sophie's stomach tightened. "And?" Ethan pushed one of the files toward her. "My lawyer found bank transfers linked to a rival company. Bennett took money months before Nora's accident. It wasn't just negligence, it was a hit." Sophie's breath caught. "You have proof?" "Enough to pursue it legally," Ethan said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "I'm having my team move forward with pressing charges." Sophie hesitated before speaking. "Ethan, if you go after him, are you ready for what comes next?" His jaw clenched. "I can't let it go. I need to know the truth." She nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Just don't let revenge become your only focus. Logan needs you more than he needs justice for something that can't be undone." Ethan looked at her then, something shifting in his expression. "You keep saying things like that," he murmured. "Like you actually care." Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I do." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Ethan Sinclair looked at her not as an employee, not as someone he needed to control, but as someone he was beginning to trust. Finally, he nodded, his voice softer this time. "Then help me do this the right way." Sophie exhaled slowly, stepping further into the room. "Okay." And just like that, something between them shifted. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about trust, about healing, about finally facing the truth. Together. Ethan had spent years making calculated decisions, ones that ensured his company's success, protected his assets, and kept his emotions locked away. But for the first time, he was making a choice that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with trust. Maxwell Bennett was being investigated. The pieces of Nora's death that had never quite fit together were finally making sense. And yet, as Ethan sat in his office late into the evening staring at the case files, he realized that revenge wouldn't bring her back. It wouldn't fix the broken parts of his life, nor would it mend the fractures in Logan's heart. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He already knew who it was. "Come in," he said quietly. Sophie stepped inside, hesitant but resolute. "Margaret said you've been in here all day." "I have a lot to think about." She crossed her arms. "You mean a lot to obsess over?" Ethan huffed a dry laugh. "That obvious?" Sophie gave him a pointed look. "You've spent years chasing control, Ethan. You're always looking for the next problem to solve. But Logan doesn't need a CEO. He needs his dad." Ethan rubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know how to be that." Sophie sat in the chair across from him, her voice gentle but firm. "Then let him teach you." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Sophie Ramirez, the woman who had walked into his life and refused to be dismissed, who had challenged him at every turn, who had somehow become a person he wasn't sure he could let go of. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice almost hesitant. She tilted her head, waiting. "I don't want you to go." The words were raw, unguarded. Sophie's breath caught, but she didn't let herself react too quickly. "Why?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Because Logan needs you. Because I need you." Sophie's heart pounded. "Ethan!" He stood, stepping closer, his gaze locked on hers. "You told me I had to make a choice. That trust isn't built through surveillance, but through actions." He hesitated, then said, "I want to do this the right way, with Logan, with you." Sophie swallowed hard. "You're asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be the man Logan needs. That I can be the man you can believe in." A heavy silence filled the room, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing between them. Finally, Sophie nodded. "Then prove it." A slow, almost relieved smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "I will." Sophie held his gaze, feeling something shift inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. And for the first time, Ethan Sinclair wasn't afraid of the unknown. Ethan had always been a man of action. Once he made a decision, he followed through with unwavering determination. And now he had made the most important decision of his life. He was going to prove himself to Sophie and Logan, no matter what it took. The next few weeks were filled with changes. Ethan adjusted his work schedule to spend more time with Logan. learning the small things that Sophie had instinctively known: what made Logan laugh, how to encourage him through his treatments, the simple joys of just being present. The transformation was slow, but it was real. One evening, as Sophie walked into the living room, she found Logan and Ethan sprawled on the carpet, surrounded by dinosaur figurines and spaceship models. Logan was enthusiastically explaining how a T-Rex could survive in outer space if given the right equipment. Ethan caught her gaze, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "We're designing intergalactic dinosaurs," Sophie chuckled. "Sounds revolutionary." Logan grinned up at her. "Dad's actually good at it." Something warm unfurled in Sophie's chest at the sight of them together. Ethan was finally becoming the father Logan needed. And maybe, just maybe, he was becoming something more to her too. Later that night, as Sophie stepped out onto the estate's balcony for some fresh air, she found Ethan already there, leaning against the railing. The city lights stretched out before them, but Sophie's attention was drawn to the man standing beside her. "I used to come out here a lot," Ethan admitted. "Before you and Logan, when the house felt more like a cage than a home." Sophie turned to him. "And now?" He exhaled slowly. "Now it's different." He faced her fully, his expression serious. "Because of you." Sophie's breath hitched. "Ethan." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Sophie's heart stopped. "I know I don't deserve you," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "but I also know I don't want to live another day without you." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet stunning ring. "Sophie Ramirez, will you marry me?" Sophie's hands trembled as she covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "Ethan, this is fast." "I know." His voice was steady, sure. "But life is too uncertain to wait. I love you. Logan loves you. You are already a part of our family. This is just me making it official." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. She had spent so much of her life running, afraid to get too attached, afraid of losing the people she loved. But looking into Ethan's eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Certainty. A love that wasn't fleeting or conditional. A love that was ready to stand the test of time. She took a shaky breath, then nodded. "Yes." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding before slipping the ring onto her finger. "You just made me the happiest man alive." Before Sophie could respond, a small, excited voice broke through the moment. "Did she say yes?" They turned to see Logan standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with hope. Sophie laughed through her tears. "She said yes." Logan let out a cheer and ran straight into her arms. "Does this mean you're my mom now?" Sophie choked on a sob as she hugged him tightly. "If you'll have me." Logan beamed. "Best day ever." Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them, holding his entire world close. For the first time in years, his heart felt whole. And for the first time in forever, Sophie had finally found where she belonged. The morning of the wedding dawned with the soft hush of rain pattering against the windows of the Hamptons estate. The air smelled fresh, carrying the promise of renewal. Fitting, Sophie thought as she stood before the mirror, smoothing down the delicate lace of her dress. It wasn't the grand, extravagant affair that the world expected from Ethan Sinclair. Instead, it was intimate, just close family and friends, Logan bouncing with excitement as he rehearsed his role of ring-bearer. Sophie wouldn't have wanted it any other way. As she stepped outside, her eyes met Ethan's across the garden. He stood under an arch adorned with white roses, looking at her as if she was the only thing that mattered. His suit was crisp, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. The billionaire tech mogul who once lived behind security cameras and emotional walls had stripped it all away for her, for Logan, for this moment. Margaret, standing beside Logan, gave Sophie a knowing nod before whispering something to the boy. Logan grinned and ran forward, holding out a small drawing. Sophie took it, her heart catching at the sight, a picture of the three of them, hand in hand with a smiling angel above them. "Nora," Sophie murmured, looking up at Ethan. Ethan's throat bobbed as he nodded. Logan wanted her to be part of today. Tears welled in her eyes as she tucked the drawing close to her heart. She is. With Logan walking beside her, Sophie made her way to the man who had changed her life. The ceremony was simple, the vows spoken with quiet conviction. When Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch lingered, his gaze filled with unspoken promises. "You taught me that love isn't about control," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about trust." Sophie smiled through her tears. "And you showed me that sometimes home isn't a place, it's people." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the gentle drizzle of rain became a full shower. But instead of running for cover, Ethan pulled Sophie into his arms, laughter bubbling between them as they danced under the downpour. Logan ran around them, his joy infectious. Margaret shook her head with a smile, watching from the sidelines. The guests cheered, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't care about appearances, about expectations. He had everything he needed right here. He tilted Sophie's chin up, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Are you ready for forever?" Sophie beamed, wrapping her arms around him. "With you, always." And with that, Ethan Sinclair, the man who once thought he could control fate, finally let go, embracing the beautiful, unpredictable, messy miracle that was love. As the rain fell around them, they danced, laughter and love filling the air. Together, as a family, as a home,